comes down to one of the major management issues that we have in the world right now is how do we control the nutrients that are coming into the water? We have a situation where we have a growing world population. We have to grow more food to feed them. We mine phosphorus, we fix nitrogen through industrial processes. We put them on the land, they run off into the water, and they cause eutrophication. So understanding the dynamics of the nutrients will tell us then what the effects of this will be on the aquatic ecosystems that we rely upon. This could include drinking water quality. If we're interested in biodiversity, I just gave an example of how phosphorus content can change the diversity of macroinvertebrates. This figure is probably one of the most famous lake management figures ever, and it's a picture of the experimental lake area where Dave Schindler did an experiment where he added nitrogen and phosphorus to one side of this lake. I'm sorry, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus to one side of this lake, and carbon and nitrogen to the other side of this lake. And he just put a curtain between them. And this is a cyanobacterial bloom. It's basically reflecting much more light back, so it looks really light. And this is a relic of the great phosphorus wars, where limnologists said that the reason we're having eutrophication in many of the lakes around the world is that phosphorus-containing compounds are being put into the water, and that's stimulating primary productivity. And the soap and detergent companies didn't want to hear that because that's where much of that phosphorus was coming from. And so they suggested, no, when you dump sewage in, there's a bunch of carbon, biochemical oxygen demand in there, and the algae are limited by carbon. And that's what's doing it. It's not our fault. We don't have to do anything about the phosphate in the detergents. When he added carbon and nitrogen here, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus here, he showed that it was not the carbon that led to the algal blooms. And this then led to a lot of legislation and regulation and a better understanding of the factors that limit eutrophication in fresh waters. So in this chapter, we'll talk about what does trophic state actually mean, why does nutrient pollution matter, natural and cultural eutrophication, because there's natural processes that lead to enrichment, how we can use relationships between nutrients, water quality, and phytoplankton to manage lakes, mitigating lake eutrophication, and then talk about streams and wetlands, because that's also a concern, and then go through a few case studies. So essentially, trophic state ultimately is based on how much production there is in the system, right? Because trophic means to eat or food, and that is the rate that things are happening at. But functionally what happens is that we measure the algal biomass, and we assume that if there's more primary producers, there's more production. Or we measure the nutrients and assume that more nutrients means more biomass, which means more production. And what this allows us to do is it gives us a way to give a continuum of the various trophic states. So you can imagine there's some places like in granitic basins, which have almost no nutrients coming into them and are fed by rainwater, that lakes naturally would be very nutrient poor or oligotrophic, right? Have very low levels of production. Other areas, you know, if they were in, say, an ancient, shallowed out from an ancient seabed where there's a lot of nutrients and sediments, might normally be more nutrient rich. You'd expect, for example, an oxbow lake off the edge of the Kansas River or the Mississippi River, because it's in an area where sediments and organic materials have been deposited, in nutrients associated with those would be more productive than a lake up in the Rocky Mountains, right, that doesn't have all that nutrients, that's washed out of the mountains out onto the plains, basically. So we can compare systems across large areas, and we can say what's natural for an area and what's too high nutrient. And if we want to be a little bit more accurate about this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, we should think about heterotrophic state and autotrophic state, because the sources of food for food webs can either be self-generated, self-feeding, autotrophic, or they can be other-generated, come in from outside. So if we think of a stream, for example, that has a canopy cover on it, its food web is determined much by how much leaf material falls in, not how much algal productivity there is in the system. So heterotrophic state, the degree of carbon input, may influence that system more than autotrophic state, which might be a minor consideration. In contrast, a lake might, be dominated by phytoplankton pulling carbon into the system, although we're finding out that runoff of carbon from the land is much more important than we thought previously. So this is essentially an evolving view of, and a more nuanced view of how ecosystems work than the sort of simple thing, nutrients, chlorophyll. But we'll start with nutrients and chlorophyll. So here's some trophic classification systems. And we have chlorophyll here. And this is the OECD. A bunch of people from Europe and North America came together and said, okay, my lake is eutrophic. Here's its condition. And they put them all together and they made a probability distribution. And so they decided, if the lake is hypertrophic, that chlorophyll should be above, probably above this range, somewhere in here. But the probability is if it's up at over 100 micrograms per liter chlorophyll, that it is a hypertrophic lake, super productive. If it has less than 1/10 of a microgram per liter chlorophyll, it'd be ultra eutrophic. So Crater Lake, Lake Tahoe, some of these really super clean lakes would be here. And then we see everything arrayed out in between here. And then get to this idea. This is Bob Carlson has this trophic state index. And what he says is, okay, you get this phosphorus, and that should translate to this much chlorophyll. And this much chlorophyll should absorb light, so this will be more chlorophyll, more phosphorus, shorter Secchi depth, right? And then you go across and you read trophic state from hypertrophic to ultra oligotrophic. And these scales right here, this chlorophyll scale here, approximately corresponds to the range of that there. So this is something that some managers use to just put trophic state on a scale of 0 to 100. Pollution matters in algal blooms matter in lakes. And we have this series of issues that are associated oftentimes with cyanobacterial blooms. And the first is that when there's a big bloom of algae in a lake, the water doesn't taste good and it doesn't smell good. And so if this is for drinking water, a lot of municipalities have to spend a substantial amount of money to get that taste and odor out, which, for example, the city of Wichita has put millions of dollars into an activated charcoal filter to get the taste and odor problems from their lake out of the water. And that's pushing them to make changes in their watershed management for their drinking water reservoir. It's very common in many parts of the world to have that. In addition, toxic algae can bloom, and we have places around the country where this is occurring, and especially as it gets warmer, as the climate warms, the probability of a cyanobacterial bloom increases, and the cyanobacteria tend to be more likely to be toxic than the other ones. There have not been many human deaths associated with toxic algae, although there have been a few. The worst case was in Brazil, where they took some water that was that had a toxic bloom in it, and they didn't get the toxin out, and they used it as in a dialysis treatment clinic, and they killed a number of people with that because it got them. So you can imagine, that's just putting it right into your bloodstream. There's also, we talked about this, the idea that people actually pay less for property near a scummy lake than they do a clear lake, and there's studies that go out and look at what people actually pay to live in particular places. and they pay more to live near an ice lake, and so you can have a substantial impact on that on that as well. And not only do they pay more to live on a clear lake, they pay more to live in a city that's near a clear lake as opposed to in a city that's not. And recreation also depends upon lake quality. If a lake has intense cyanobacterial blooms, people aren't going to want to swim in it. They're not going to want to fish on it. It's just not a pleasant place to be because of all that taste and odor, and it's not perceived as being a healthy situation. And the final one is fish kills, because if you build up a really high production, you have a lot of organic carbon there and a lot of active biomass, and if at nighttime there's minimal mixing, you can have the oxygen levels drop quite low and below levels that can support fishes. A lot of the warm water fish species are more tolerant than the cold water species. So say the salmonids are fairly intolerant of both warmer temperatures and lower oxygen, as opposed to, say, catfish or something like that, which experiences it more frequently in their natural environment because they live in warmer waters, which naturally has lower oxygen in it because the saturation point is lower in warmer water. Every year we get a lot of fish kills in Kansas, and many of them are associated with algal blooms and high concentration of algae. The other big place for fish kills is there's a lot of winter fish kills where you actually get an ice cover and it keeps the oxygen from getting into the lake. And snow on top of the ice means that there's no photosynthesis, so there's no light or oxygen getting created in the lake, or light getting through that ice. So it does matter, and we have a paper that I did with some students where we've actually put the millions of dollars in the U.S. are essentially lost to eutrophication of lakes because it decreases these ecosystem goods and services that lakes provide for humanity. So there's this idea that there's cultural eutrophication, which is caused by humans, but then there's also this idea of this sort of natural succession of lakes. And there's this classic view that lakes fill slowly and become more eutrophic and eventually turn into a meadow. And this idea comes from the fact that the leaders of limnology, the people who created the field in Europe and then in North America, were in areas that were glaciated and would have lakes that were fairly small, were created about 10,000 years ago when the glaciers receded. And those lakes, being somewhat shallow, over time would fill, and you could see the whole sequence of something that's a shallow pond that was deeper at one point, a meadow that was clearly a pond before, and then remaining lakes. And so you could reconstruct this idea that yes, sediments do wash into lakes, they do fill up over time, and you get this succession. And as they fill, they become more and more productive, because we know, for example, that shallower lakes tend to be more productive than deeper lakes. And that wetlands are among the most productive habitats on Earth, which we'll find out when we get to our ecosystems chapter. And so that general view of this natural succession is one that sort of permeated the textbooks like you've got. And it's something, though, that's not always true. And we have some lakes, for example, we've talked about Lake Baikal and Lake Tanganyika, and they have millions of years worth of sediments on the bottom of them. Yet they are oligotrophic lakes, and they have remained oligotrophic lakes for some period of time. And part of the reason for that is that they're both tectonic lakes, and they have this subsidence of the tectonic plate is as fast as the sediment coming in, so they stay deep. And these lakes probably have a different trajectory of trophic change. So we can think of the last glaciation in Baikal. Baikal could have been frozen over there's certainly intense glaciation in the watershed, and as those glaciers receded, there would have been a lot of soil that was exposed, lack of vegetative cover, and a whole lot of nutrient input. So it's fairly likely that that lake was more eutrophic after the glaciers went away, and then as that nutrient washed its way out of the watershed and it got deposited in the sediment and buried in the sediment, it became more back to its oligotrophic state. So it may be that eventually they'll fill, but for most all of their history, they'll end up being oligotrophic. Relative to that type of eutrophication, cultural eutrophication is essentially worldwide, and as we talked about before, humans are fixing nitrogen at twice the rate it would be fixed naturally for our agriculture. That is, if you add all the legumes and all the nitrogen fixation that occurs on Earth together, the rate that we're using Haber-Bosch process to convert nitrogen gas to fertilizer is equal to that. And we're throwing that all on the crops, and some of that makes it into the water. And so we're increasing the nitrogen concentrations in the water in areas that have agriculture 10, 100 times higher than they were naturally. It's fairly consistent. In addition, phosphorus is also increasing, both because of increases in uses of detergents in urban areas, and phosphate is a very good detergent, but also because of addition of phosphate fertilizer that's added to the cropland, and some of that makes it off into the water. And this is phosphate that again is mined out of the land and where there are deposits and concentrations of it, and it is mined at about the rate that all of the phosphorus on Earth naturally weathers out of the system. So we're also doubling the rate, that rate as well. So when we manage this, how do we deal with it? We need to understand the correlations between nutrients and algal biomass. And we can also talk about fish populations, because there's this idea of a trophic cascade that alters the way that systems respond to nutrients. I'll cover this again, but the basic idea with the fish populations is that zooplankton eat algae. If you have more zooplankton, you get less algal, the algal blooms are less likely to be as intense. If you have small fish that eat the zooplankton, then that control will disappear. The type of fish that people like to catch are the big fish that eat the small fish. So if you take those all out, you increase the production of small fish, decrease the zooplankton, and increase the algae. So you can actually manipulate the food web to get more or less algae in the system. And we'll get back to that. It's called the trophic cascade, and we'll talk about top-down versus bottom-up control of production when we get to the complex interactions and ecosystems and community stuff. But I want to bring it up here too. So we're talking about nutrient biomass relationships. This is a group of lakes. Val Smith collected data from throughout the world. Total phosphorus on the x-axis, and this is chlorophyll. This is generally mean concentration in the summer in the epilimnion. And we see that there's also a nitrogen effect here, and that essentially if there's a higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, right, if there's more nitrogen available than relative to phosphorus, then you actually get a higher yield of chlorophyll per unit phosphorus. That is, high nitrogen phosphorus points tend to fall here, lower nitrogen phosphorus points tend to fall here. You get less yield out of it. So this gets back to this idea of co-limitation and nitrogen and phosphorus both being important. That is, you can have a lot of co-limitation, and if you have both elements in abundance, then you're going to have the highest potential yields of chlorophyll. So you can see the natural variance, but you can draw a pretty good line between these, what are probably fairly oligotrophic lakes that fall in that oligotrophic area, and hypertrophic lakes would fall up here, and that's that range of trophic states we talked about already. And then you can use graphs like this to link the phosphorus here to the chlorophyll, and then go down and figure out what your Secchi depth is. So this is nice because what people want to do is they want a clear lake. They don't care how much chlorophyll is in it. If you tell John Q. Public you have 10 milligrams per liter of chlorophyll or 10 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll, they're not going to care, right? But if you tell them, if I decrease my phosphorus from here to here, from 10 to 1 milligram per liter in this lake, then my chlorophyll will drop from about here to here, and that will be an increase in Secchi depth from about 1 to 4 meters. So you'll be able to have that much clearer of a lake. And that's what people care about when it comes to selling nutrient control plans and that kind of thing. It also is useful because a lot of the citizen monitoring programs that they have for lakes actually send people out to measure Secchi depth over time. So we have a lot of Secchi depth data, and you can know what annual variation is, how much regionally it is, how that relates to a clean lake, relates to a dirty lake. It's something really obvious for people to see. So that's typical. And these are, obviously you saw the noise around the graph I had before. These lines are just the statistical relationship, and there's variance in there. So how do you actually control eutrophication? You can control the nutrient sources from outside. You can treat the nutrients once they are in the lake, and sometimes you have to remove plants, large plant growth. So these are the three different approaches you take. So how do you remove it before it gets in? Well, there's this series of things that you might go through as a manager to deal with this. And the first would be that you find a lake that's a problem, or somebody would come to you and say, I have a lake that's a problem. You need to characterize the lake morphology, measure where all the nutrient inputs are. So perhaps you would have an area that has agricultural cropland that's running through fields, but there's no buffer, so you put that in. Maybe there's a sewage treatment here. You'd have a phosphorus ban, and you'd say, okay, you can't use phosphate-containing detergents anymore in this region. Maybe you'd protect the riparian to keep things from flowing, sediments from flowing, something like that. Decrease the fertilizer addition rate to only what's needed. Make people go off septic tanks that are leaking into the system, put them on a municipal system. Pump the sewage out of the watershed into somebody else's watershed. That happens all the time. And then what you can do is you can project, given these, you can project what the nutrient loading is going to be to the epilimnion with the equations that essentially link the loading rate and the sedimentation rate out. So you have this influx in the streams and the rivers, you have an outflow in the river going out, and then you have this consistent loss rate of stuff that's settling out. But if you know what all those are, you can then figure out what your concentration will end up being. It's just like I told you about the stable point for the nutrient concentration. If you know the input rates and the output rates, then you can get at what the expected concentration is. And that's all this is a graph of. You would use that type of graph and say, okay, if I control this, this, and this, then I can lower my loading by this much. This will lower the phosphorus by X amount, which would lower the chlorophyll by such amount. We can project the effect on lake clarity, because it'll lower the chlorophyll. The lake will get that much clearer. And then you'll say, okay, we can figure out how much this is going to cost. Is it worth it, right? So go back and look at these control strategies. Is it worth it? And then if you decide it is or not, you move forward and you make your actions. And you continue to monitor afterwards to make sure that it worked. Right? You always have to follow up on these things. The typical thing is if you hire a consulting company and only pay them so much, they come in and say, here's your plan. and then they're gone, right? So there's no accountability. But if you're in agency work, a lot of times you need to follow up and prove that you're actually doing what you say you're gonna do, or else the public will eventually revolt and say, no, I'm not gonna stand for lowering fertilizer on my cropland or something like that. So you have to have accountability built into the system, feedbacks.
So this is for lakes, but isn't there a lot of recycling of nutrients in lakes, and once they're there, the mitigation really does help? Reducing future loads really does help? Or is it just getting recycled back?
We'll talk about that, but yes, definitely. But the problem is, the first thing is, do you control it before it gets in? And once it gets in, what happens is the next set of questions. So yeah, that's a good point. No, I'll get to it. But okay, so I've mentioned there that land use can affect nutrient input into the lake, and so that's the one thing you'll assess if you're first talking about external loading. And there's these ranges then of nitrogen flux that you can use from different land uses, from cropland, and you can see it can vary a lot. Feedlots are way up there, you know, they really put a lot in unless you treat the sewage that's coming off. And forests and pastures are down in here somewhere, so you can get a kind of an idea of what the different aspects are. And then these are some wet and dry depositions, so you also have to account for, I don't know, if you're near, say, a pig farm that puts a lot of nitrogen in the air, and the next watershed over it could be dropping a lot on you in the nearby. So this gives you an idea of the sort of the way that people look at land use and nutrient inputs to lakes. And there's good relationships in many places, and Kansas is certainly a good case of that. These are data from Kansas, and this is just the percentage of watershed that's in cropland as a function of the total nitrogen in the rivers and streams that are draining those, and we see there's a very clear relationship to this. This is also an interesting graph because you can say, okay, we don't have these three systems that have less than 10% cropland. So what was the natural nutrient concentration? What we can actually do is say, okay, I've got the statistical relationship, and I can extrapolate down to zero cropland and make an estimate of what it would have been with no cropland at all. Okay, so this gets back to what Danelle was talking about, and this also gets back to why I like that sulfur iron thing. And that is, just like with disease, it is better to treat the ultimate cause than the symptoms, right? And this is true for most cases of pollution. You have oil pollution, right? I can take a barrel of oil and dump it onto the ground, and if I just don't dump it, it doesn't cost hardly anything. Once I dump it, it's millions of dollars to get it back up out of the groundwater, right? With heart attacks, it's cheaper to modify your diet for 20 years than it is to go in and get a heart transplant. And the reason for this in lakes is because once the hypolimnion goes anoxic, the mixing of the phosphorus back into the system every year makes it very difficult to push that away from a stable state of being very eutrophic. So remember I talked that the loading's coming in, the algae take up that phosphorus, they die, maybe the zooplankton eat the algae, they die, they excrete, the stuff falls down into the hypolimnion. And if it's an aerobic hypolimnion, it continues to, it'll make it all the way down into the sediment, right? And if it dissociates, when the microbes dissociate that phosphate away from that, when they break it down and excrete that phosphate, if there's iron there, it will bond with that phosphate, make a precipitate that will stay in the sediment. If there's oxygen throughout the hypolimnion, then there's an oxidized microzone on the top of that sediment that will keep any phosphorus as it gets buried further, and we know that once it gets anoxic, it dissociates, right? Fe3+ goes to Fe2+. Fe2 plus and Fe3 and PO4 3- don't bond to each other, right? They have different charges. They don't make that insoluble precipitate. So they break apart in anoxic conditions. The phosphate can diffuse back up, but if there's iron up above it and in oxidized conditions, it'll precipitate down. So you get this layer of oxidized iron phosphate right at the top of right above the anoxic zone. If you fertilize enough that over the period of the summertime when the lake is stratified, the hypolimnion goes anoxic, then that phosphate gets all the way up into the hypolimnion. Next fall, the lake mixes and the phosphate comes back up through the whole system. And that's called internal loading. That means that once you get a lake to that point, if you add enough phosphorus, it's very difficult to get that phosphorus back out. It'll take many, many years for it to get back out if it can't be sedimented out in the system. So in this case, you can control all the non-point sources and you get no response, right? Which is, that's not good. You put all this money into advanced sewage treatment, but you have no response. So then the question is, well, what do you do about it if you got to this point? I'll take a quick detour here and then we'll get back to what you do as we talk about the different case studies. But the next point is magnified control. And that's another negative aspect of eutrophication, that if you put nutrients in, then the plants can grow so thick that people can't use the lake for swimming or boating. And the question is, how do you control those? And sometimes you get into a bad situation because this is another stable state of a lake, and that is high macrophyte biomass inhibits phytoplankton blooms, and so you can have a lot of macrophytes and no phytoplankton. You take the macrophytes all out and push it back to a system where the phytoplankton do okay, they shade out the macrophytes, and they don't grow so well. So there's a lot of times when people need to take macrophytes out, and the most common one is probably just a physical. You just remove them. You just remove it. But the problem is it just grows right back. In a lot of the upper Midwest, where people have lakes where they recreate, they have cottages on, or they live near them and they like to swim in them, it's sort of like mowing your lawn. You go out and you cut the macrophytes out of the area that you want to use for swimming and boating. That's that. You can use chemical treatment. This is rapid. With any chemical, there might be biomagnification and non-target effects. That's not great. This is common. This is particularly a common way to use to get rid of invasive macrophytes that people don't want. And that's one of the ones that's another reason people try to get rid of the macrophytes. Sometimes it's the only way to do it. Just poison them all out, and then maybe reintroduce the ones that you want to keep in there. You can seal the sediment off with plastic if you have a small lake. Basically, if you just shade everything out with plastic, you can just keep them from growing back up again. Then it becomes more like a swimming pool than a lake, but it's something that's done. And then there's this biological control, and this is basically grass carp. And people will add these grass carp and they'll eat the macrophytes, and it's a fairly cheap way. You'll usually, if they're allowed at all, they're triploid grass carp, so they can't reproduce, although I don't know how well they check that. The tendency is for people to say, I don't want any of this moss, or whatever they call it, these pond weeds in there. And so what they'll do is they'll add they'll say, oh, I'll just add a whole bunch of these grass carp.